Hello, everyone. Glad to see that everybody could make it to class this week, if not in class, via video this week. So the topic that we're going to be discussing this time is going to be that of war and violence. War and violence. Now, the thing about violence is that violence doesn't just take place on sort of a macro scale, right? Certainly, nations are involved with violence against one another. Nations are involved with going to war and having military actions and things like that. But violence is also, and probably for each one of us, the more applicable, I guess, source of violence or time we interact or come into contact with violence is on a much smaller scale. It happens in our neighborhoods. We have violence. We hear of violence going on in our neighborhoods and our streets. For some of us, violence has even taken place in our own homes. Certainly, each one of us have been angry at some point, and while maybe not engaging in violence in particular ourselves, nonetheless understand the sort of impulse that might lead one to that point. Thinking back on childhood and things like that, we can imagine at some point, maybe in our lives, we've experienced violence in one kind or another. And violence as an ethical question is related to: is it ever justified? Are we ever justified in using violence? And certainly, what we want to do is look at principles that govern not only violence on a large scale, in the scale of nations and countries going to war. But also violence in our own sort of interpersonal lives. Are there principles that we can talk of or discuss of that use where we can decide whether or not violence is ever appropriate for us to resort to that? Now, your book, as you read your book, it places most of the emphasis on the aspect of war, nations going to war. Is it ever appropriate to use violence as a means of subduing an evil state or enforcing justice and things like that? But I hope to, at least as we mention each one of these three views that your book discusses, also maybe shed a little light on how the principles that are used in these views would apply to a more specific application in our lives as well. So anyway, let's take a look at those three views. The views that your book mentions are the views of realism, pacifism, and just war theory. Realism, pacifism, and just war theory, and we'll look at each one in turn. The first two, realism and pacifism, are fairly straightforward, not that complicated to sort of to understand. Now, it may be a view that you dismiss or you don't like, but it's still not terribly complicated to understand. The first one that we'll look at is that of realism. Your book mentions realism in the defining factor of realism, or one who is a realist when it comes to war, is it's the view that whenever you're involved in war, that you are permitted to make use of any and whatever means necessary in order to achieve your objective of victory. So whenever you are in war, you can do whatever it takes in order to win. That is the view of realism. Now, realism is based off of a basic premise that that our life in general is characterized by a struggle for supremacy and a struggle for survival. That's the underlying premise of the view of realism, that our life is a struggle for supremacy or a struggle for survival. And if you lose that struggle, especially a struggle for survival, you don't have anything left. And so we are justified in making use of whatever means necessary in order to achieve that goal of victory, of survival. There are no limits when engaged in war, when engaged in conflict, when engaged in this struggle. There are no limits whatsoever to whatever it takes to survive, whatever it takes to come out on top. That's realism. Now, not sure exactly why the book calls it realism. Perhaps those who espouse the view, they believe that that's the only realistic way to look at the world. Who knows? But that's the name that the book is given to it, and so that's what we'll go with right now. But realism, the view that you may do anything necessary in order to survive, in order to come out on top. Now, I want you to notice first of all that that realism is an inherently consequentialist viewpoint. In other words, it's basically saying that the ends justifies the means. The ends, which in this case is victory or survival, justifies whatever means that you need to take in order to ensure or achieve that victory or survival. That it is a consequentialist ethics. It's judging the moral value of the means or of the act based on what it accomplishes, what it achieves. So just keep that in mind. It is a consequentialist method, or consequentialist understanding, a consequentialist view. Now you can imagine what some of the tactics or some of the methods, if we're thinking large scale, if we're considering a large scale war or something like that. You can imagine some of the methods that might be allowed or permissible under realism. Not only conventional warfare, where soldiers are going at one another with guns and bombs and rockets and things like this, but also if it helps, the realist would not necessarily be opposed to using things like napalm, which was a tactic of warfare that was banned some time ago. It's napalm is a flammable agent that basically you drop the napalm bomb or however you apply it. You drop it in whatever area and it just burns everything. It's a sticky sort of flammable substance that sticks to you and burns and you can't get it off of you. They made some use of that during the Vietnam War, and after sort of what came out of that, nations decided to not use that, to put an end to that afterwards. Plus, the damage to things like infrastructure and the damage to the environment and things like that was terrible. So, but the realist, I mean, if napalm is required to ensure victory, the realist would not necessarily be opposed to using it. Also, the realist would not necessarily be opposed to using things like torture. You've captured an enemy. You need to know where their troop movements are headed, where they're located. You need to know that really quickly. Well, interrogation using torture or so-called enhanced interrogation techniques would not necessarily be out of question for the realist. If it helps us achieve victory, the realist would be more than willing to use it. This also goes toward things like pillaging, looting villages, shooting or terrorism, acts of terrorism. In other words, engaging non-combatants in a military or in a field of war, anything like that. All of that may be on the table for the realist. It may be something that they would make use of in order to achieve victory. By now, you're probably thinking, well, these guys sound very militaristic. The people who are realists, these are war hawks who believe in strength through superior firepower and this sort of thing. Who will be able to do or willing to do whatever it takes. That these are people who just want to go, sort of carpet bomb the area so as to annihilate the enemy. Well, that may be the case, but then again, there may be also very good reasons for a realist to sort of scale back the amount of violence or the amount of militarism that is included in a particular conflict. For example, if you remember the story of the Alamo in the history of the United States, back in the 1800s when Texas was still a disputed territory between the United States and Mexico, there was an outpost known as the Alamo. It started out sort of as a mission in the middle of the desert, which now is San Antonio, I believe. But the Alamo was there. as sort of a midpoint, but it was sort of a fortress, a makeshift fortress in the middle of the desert. It represented sort of a holdout for Americans, sort of on the border of the disputed area there. Well, the Alamo was peopled by a number of people. I believe it was less than 200. You can Google that or check your history book, but it was relatively few, and it was held down by relatively few people. And the army of General Santa Anna from Mexico came through in order to sort of wrest control of the area, the disputed territory, came through to the Alamo and surrounded them. There was no escape. They cut off any form of escape. The army of Santa Anna was several thousand people strong, and so there was no chance of victory for the people who held the Alamo. And Santa Anna gave them a chance and a choice. Look, if you surrender, we'll let you go, and this sort of thing. And the people at the Alamo said, no, we're not going to give up our post. Well, long story short, the army of Santa Anna, after trying to get them to surrender peacefully, decides, okay, let's go in and take it by force. They go in, they take it by force, and they just basically kill everybody at the Alamo. Everybody's dead, including people like Jim Bowie, famous knife maker responsible for the Bowie knife. Also, Daniel Boone was there, and one of the sort of a celebrity at the point. I think he had been a representative to Tennessee, but he was a national figure, very well known. Anyway, they kill everybody at the Alamo, and word gets out. Word gets out to the Americans who were living north, north of the territory. Word gets out that the Alamo had just been utterly destroyed. No survivors, right? Nobody lives. And that so infuriates the Americans that are there that Sam Houston begins to raise an army, and he raises an army sufficiently large to eventually go and engage the army of Santa Anna and put an end to them. So what was Santa Anna's biggest mistake here? Well, it was killing everybody. It was killing everybody at the Alamo. It was being overly militaristic. Now, if he had done something less than that, it is very probable that the people and the passions of the people would not have been inflamed against Santa Anna, and he could have more easily gone into and progressed through Texas and taken part of that area that was disputed for themselves. But because they went in and just laid waste to the people of the Alamo, the rally cry of the Americans from then on in that particular conflict was "Remember the Alamo." And the idea was, remember those who remember how the enemy has dealt terribly with us, how they've destroyed us, how they've been overly militaristic. And so the realist would do well to remember the Alamo, right? The realist would do well to scale back the amount of militarism in their approach to warfare in order to avoid engendering the passions of people who right now are not quite committed to warfare. In that way, he alienates his enemy from any possible support they might have and can achieve victory. So if victory can come better through being more militaristic, through just completely annihilating the enemy, then that's what we do. But if victory is best achieved by other means, by doing it slowly, or by sanctions or embargoes, everything is open, everything is on the table when it comes to achieving victory in a particular conflict. But the realist would certainly not be opposed to the use of violence in a conflict. So that would be sort of the realist view as it comes to using violence in relationship to warfare. Should we use warfare? The realist would say yes. Use warfare. Use any and all that you need to, and just make sure that you're going to achieve victory. Okay. Well, that's the realist view, and sometimes the problem with the realist view is that it leaves a bad taste in people's mouths. Because of the horrors of war. Anyone who has ever been involved in an armed conflict knows that the glory that people often speak of is sort of an elusive thing. Yes, that might be there. However, However, there's great sadness that comes with it. There's great there are things that are stamped into your memory that you cannot get rid of, and it's just horrific in some ways. And so, sort of the other end of the spectrum, there's a view called pacifism. This view is probably one that we're at least in name familiar with, pacifism. And pacifism is the view that there is never a justification, or there is very little justification to ever resort to violence. So there's really never a reason to resort to violence in a military conflict. There's never really a reason to resort to violence in one's personal life. That would be the pacifist view. Now, the pacifist view is a primarily deontological view. In this way, it differs from that of realism, right? So realism is consequentialist, do whatever it takes to achieve victory. Pacifism is based on a deontological view that human beings or human life has so much value that we should never, that there's never a justification for taking it or for harming it in order to achieve your objective. Pacifism is primarily the deontological view that says that rational beings have a duty. Okay, remember, deontological equals duty. The rational beings have an obligation to avoid the use of violence. So we need to achieve victory by other means. Now, a lot of times people will hear the view of rationalism, and they will consider the view of rationalism sort of a wimpy view, or not rationalism, I'm sorry, pacifism as a wimpy view, that people who are pacifists really are cowards who don't want to get, who are afraid to get their hands dirty and who are afraid to get hurt. That they are afraid of conflict. That's not necessarily the case, though, because for pacifists, theirs is a positive commitment to nonviolence. In other words, it's not as if the pacifist lives in a dream world where everything is unicorns and roses, right? Where everybody's just going to get along forever. No, the pacifist realizes that there's going to be conflict in the world. There's going to be conflict in their life. There'll probably be people that they get into conflicts with that don't necessarily like them. And so the pacifist realizes that these things happen. The only difference is the pacifist is committed to using nonviolent methods in order to deal with conflict. Now, on a national level, some of those nonviolent commitments or commitment to nonviolence might be taking the effect of things like embargoes, which is where a nation refuses to do business with another nation, refuses to buy from them, refuses to sell to them, and enter into trade with them in order to sort of punish them for whatever they're doing that they don't find acceptable. So there's embargoes. There are trade sanctions, which embargoes are a form of that. A trade sanction says, look, we're not going to trade with you unless you stop doing this with, whatever act that they don't like, whatever act is, the conflict. There may be other forms of pressure, diplomatic pressure that different nations can put on one another that don't resort to violence and so forth. But the idea here is that we solve or resolve conflicts without recourse to violence. Now, pacifists are, there are many pacifists who are famous. The book mentions a couple of them anyway. It makes mention of Mahatma Gandhi, who used things like hunger strikes and gaining public support for his cause in order to make a great change there in India. The other person that the book notably mentions is Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who is noteworthy for his work, his life's work in the cause of civil rights. These are a couple of individuals that the book mentions who are examples, primary examples of pacifists. Hold on just a second.